Now, here is an interesting dichotomy. Now, HSBC does $60 trillion of suspicious activity, and somehow they just don't catch it, and they continue to make millions of dollars off of it. But when it comes to Elliott Spitzer's transactions, well, they happen to catch that right away. That's really interesting. Do you know what it was totaling? 3 wire transfers totaling roughly $10,000 to QAT International. That wound up being the escort service, a shell account. So get a load of this. A bank catches suspicious activity from 3 wire transfers for $10,000. HSBC couldn't catch $60 trillion worth of suspicious activity. What a gigantic joke this is. Now, you'll see why in a second when they happen to catch Elliott Spitzer's activity. Now, of course, Spitzer was the governor of New York and had to step down after they found out that he was involved with that escort service. Now, they said, well, we had to. Look, here's an expert that they quote. They still didn't know what the business was, and they started digging into the account. Is it drugs, money laundering? They then start to see money from Spitzer. Well, look, they got to look into it if it's drugs or money laundering. Unless, of course, it's $60 trillion worth of drugs and money laundering that HSBC, for example, didn't look into. Well, these banks had to look into Spitzer's account. I mean, it was a whole $10,000. Imagine if it was drug money. Wow. Well, that's why they had to do it. New York Times explains, experts who advise banks and individuals on anti-money laundering regulations said that the 2 banks were just following the law when they reported suspicious financial transactions to federal authorities. Well, they didn't have a choice, did they? If there's ever a suspicious activity, you've got to report it, unless, of course, it's $60 trillion worth of suspicious activity. Our entire justice system is a joke. As we continue, the New York Times explains, as part of the Know Your Customer requirements, banks must assess their clients' financial patterns and set guidelines to ensure that an alarm is sounded if there are unusual transactions. Oh, do they have a program called Know Your Customer? Really? When it's Elliott Spitzer who used to go after the banks, they happen to know his accounts really, really well. That was back in 2008. Now, when we find out, hey, after 9/11 for 10 years, you know that they did this all the way up till 2010? If your customer happens to be someone connected to Al-Qaeda or Iran or a Mexican drug lord, then don't know your customer that much. And then former director of FinCEN, which is the government organization of the Treasury Department that's supposed to look into this, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, that's what it stands for. He says, what 9/11 taught us is the value of financial information. Money doesn't lie. Money leaves a footprint. And that's exactly what happened with Spitzer. Funny how money didn't leave a footprint when it was $60 trillion worth of suspicious activity involving drug warlords and Al-Qaeda. But hey, $10,000, well, it leaves a lot of footprints. So, which bank found these very important footprints and went after Spitzer? Because, my God, you got to know your customer. Let me quote the New York Times from back in 2008. Mr. Spitzer's suspicious financial transactions at North Fork might never have been discovered were it not for a suspicious activity report filed by HSBC. So when it came to a guy that was investigating these banks, well, they found every nook and cranny, including 3 transactions that barely got to $10,000. But $60 trillion, that same exact bank couldn't track it all when they were making billions off of it. And why? Well, let me give you one last quote from the New York Times here. As it turned out, both North Fork Bank and HSBC had faced inquiries into their lending practices led by Mr. Spitzer when he was New York Attorney General. Funny how they happened to find the suspicious activity in that tiny little account when they couldn't find $7 billion worth of suspicious activity coming in from Mexican drug lords, $19 billion from Iran, untold sums from the Al-Qaeda bank, and $60 trillion overall. You get a sense of the fraud and hypocrisy that goes on here. If you go after the big banks, if you go after the government, they will come to get you. But if you help organizations that target us, 60,000 dead in Mexico over the war on drugs, 3,000 dead during 9/11. Well, you're free to go. What could you do? I mean, you're just the top bankers, and if we actually put you in jail, it might destabilize our whole economy. It is repulsive what is happening in this country.